All right, so today in Thoughtmetrics, all we're going to do is basically just run through the principles or the basics of Thoughtmetrics. Now, this will allow us to actually understand the basic notations in mathematics that we can use to actually kind of create a foundation to understand the relationship between mind and matter. But first and foremost, we need to understand where are we starting from? How are we going to more like express thoughts or basically consciousness in terms of a mathematical expression that will actually give us more of an idea of where we are coming from. So when you look at dot matrix, first and foremost, it all begins from physics, because physics is actually a field of study that goes so much deep into understanding the way the world operates. And in physics, we know that matter, right, exists in three states, right? So mainstream physics has told us that matter can exist in three states. And the first state, we know that it can exist in a solid state, as well as in a liquid state, and in a gas state, right? So basically, matter can exist in three forms of states, which are basically solid, liquid, and gas, right? Now, when you look at the scientific direction today, we have come to realize, I think when you read a paper by Max Tegmark, you come across information that talks of another state of matter, which is consciousness. Now, consciousness today is now being described as a form of matter, right? So meaning matter can also exist as a form of consciousness. And when you look at everything in the universe, it can be looked at in terms of particles. And particles can be considered to be different states of matter depending in whichever form they are existing, right? So you'll notice that liquids have got matter. Liquids have got, solids, they have particles, as well as liquids, they also have particles, as well as gases, they have particles. So when you look at solids, their particles are closely packed. That's what physics tells us, right? Very closely packed. And that's what makes solids kind of hard. They have this hard texture or surface that you can feel, right? Then when you look at solid liquids, their patterns of particles are moderately packed, not very closely packed, but they are just moderately packed. And that's what makes liquids flexible. You know, when you put them in a particular solid, they will take, as long as that particular solid, say maybe like a cup, they will take up the form of that particular solid or wherever you put it, right? If you put liquids in, say, a tube, they'll take up the space in that particular tube. You put the liquid in, say, maybe a jar, they'll fill up that jar and things like that. So they are flexible, right? Then when you look at gases, their particles are very spacely packed, independent. The particles are kind of independent from each other, so you notice that they are somehow like that. And this is why it's very difficult for you to really observe the gases using just your naked eye. So you may need some instruments to actually maybe visualize, be able to see how the gases are actually moving around the areas. Because remember that there is that concept of motion behind all particles. Every particle vibrates, so you'll notice that the vibration in solids also exists. as well as in liquids, all these particles actually vibrate, and that motion is what basically keeps these particles changing. So ideally, it all boils down to matter and particles in particular different states of matter. So when you look at consciousness, now we are wondering, how is consciousness going to be more like visualized in a particle form? So this is where scientists have come to realize that, okay, we cannot really observe gases using our naked eyes because the particles seem to be very spatially packed or independent particles moving in different directions and stuff like that, and we can't observe them. But what goes beyond gases, right? What goes beyond almost things that you can't really observe with your eyes, and it's very difficult to think about how they can possibly look in your naked eyes. And that takes us to consciousness. And these things, we mostly describe them as properties of the mind rather than properties of the brain. So now you notice that for consciousness, we may expect that these are kinds of particles that we can't really see because they are at the most basic and fundamental level, such that we can only describe them as something spiritual. Now, I talked about mind and brain, right? So basically, consciousness is highly related to the mind than the brain, but these three things actually interact. For example, when we talk of the brain, we're basically talking of that organ that actually allows us to think, process information that we can see, and store that information, right? We all know what the brain basically does. But when we look at the mind, we are basically going beyond what we can just think of, process with our brain, but we are also looking at how we feel about the things around us and how we imagine or visualize these things using our own perception, mind, and soul. So you realize that this is taking us into states that are very different from those states that we have described based on physical scientific methods. Now this takes us into analyzing these things using some methods that actually kinds of goes beyond the physical. Now this is going into the spiritual part of analysis, which actually brings into mind the ideas behind how we feel and emotions and stuff like that. So you realize that consciousness as a state of matter can be described as that state in which an entity, I'll say entity, but when I say entity, I just mean anything. For example, it can be a human being, it can be an animal, it can be any other thing, right? But in this regard, let's restrict it to maybe things that have life, because so far we know that anything that has life to some extent has emotions and can think. So consciousness is actually a state in which we bring into perspective the state of emotions of something as well as the state of mind of something, and the properties. So you realize that solids have got different properties. That's what makes them different from liquids as another form of state. And liquids also have a different form of, they have different properties which makes them a little bit different from the gases or the state of gases, right? So same applies with consciousness. It is a state of matter that has different properties from all these other states of matter. So when you look at consciousness, one of the properties that we know is that it has to deal with thoughts. Thoughts is one property of consciousness, and emotions is another unique property of consciousness, right? So far, these are the only properties we can associate consciousness with, right? Of course, there could be other research papers that have been published and they have brought in new information about other properties of consciousness, but we are, as you know, in life, you cannot really know everything in life. Everybody knows part of the truth, and we keep on building how much we know by the more we read and the more we research about things and share ideas and so on and so forth. However, you cannot really know everything. There is even no much time for you to live to actually know everything. So that's the reality of life. But so far, if you look at most papers that have been published about consciousness and basically just the ideas about consciousness and what consciousness actually really is, you realize that the most important properties you arrive at when it comes to consciousness is thoughts and emotions. Because when you look further, some definitions about consciousness will tell you that consciousness is basically the state of awareness, right, of something. So if you are aware of something, then you are conscious about that particular thing. But remember that to be conscious about something, you need to be able to think of something. And